In 1845, a young exiled German walks through the working-class neighborhoods of Manchester. What he sees marks him forever. 6-year-old children working 14 hours in textile factories. Families crammed into unventilated basements. A life expectancy of 17 years in the poorest districts. He is not the first to see the misery of the Industrial Revolution. But he is the first to try to prove that this misery is not an accident. That it is a logical, predictable, inevitable result of the economic system the classicals had just described. Karl Marx is probably the most influential and most misunderstood thinker in the history of economics. Atrocious regimes have invoked his name. But before judging the political consequences, it is worth understanding what he actually said. Because some of his questions remain unanswered. In the previous episode we met the classical economists. Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Say, Mill. They built the foundations of economics as a discipline. But they left some cracks. The deepest was the labor theory of value. If the value of a good depends on the labor needed to produce it, as Smith and Ricardo said, then an uncomfortable question arises: who keeps the difference between what labor produces and what the worker receives? Marx took that question and turned it into a complete theory of capitalism. Today we are going to explore that theory. Its most powerful ideas, its predictions that proved right, and the ones that proved wrong. And the strongest criticisms that have been leveled against it. Marx started from an observation that seems obvious but had enormous implications. A worker in a Manchester textile factory produces, in a 12-hour workday, enough cloth to cover his wages in, let us say, 6 hours. The other 6 hours he produces cloth that goes directly into the factory owner's pocket. That difference is what Marx called surplus value. The worker produces more value than he receives as wages. The capitalist keeps the difference. For Marx, this was not individual abuse. It was not that there were bad bosses and good bosses. It was the very structure of the system. Capitalism, by definition, works by extracting surplus value from other people's labor. If the capitalist paid the worker the full value of what he produces, there would be no profit. And without profit, there is no capitalism. It is a powerful idea. And it has an equally powerful weakness that we will address later. Before Capital, Marx wrote about something more subtle than economic exploitation. He called it alienation, and it is perhaps his most modern idea. In a pre-industrial economy, a craftsman made a shoe from start to finish. He controlled the process, saw the result, felt pride in his work. In the factory, a worker tightens the same bolt 10,000 times a day. He does not design the product. He does not see it finished. He does not decide how it is made or to whom it is sold. Marx identified 4 forms of alienation. The worker is alienated from the product of his labor, because it does not belong to him. He is alienated from the process, because he does not control it. He is alienated from other workers, because he competes with them for a position. And he is alienated from himself, because work ceases to be an expression of his humanity and becomes pure survival. This is not just abstract theory. Anyone who has worked in a repetitive job, without autonomy, feeling like an interchangeable part of a machine, has experienced exactly what Marx was describing. And he described it in 1844. Marx was not content to analyze capitalism. He tried to explain all of human history with a single key: the class struggle. His thesis, greatly simplified, is this: in every historical period, the way things are produced determines the social structure. In feudalism, land was the means of production, and society was organized around lords and serfs. In capitalism, factories and capital are the means of production, and society is organized around capitalists and workers. Each system contains within itself the seed of its own destruction. Feudalism generated a class of merchants who eventually overthrew it. Capitalism, according to Marx, generates a working class that will eventually do the same. Historical materialism has an undeniable elegance. It explains a lot with very little. But it also oversimplifies a great deal. History cannot be reduced to economic conflicts. Religion, culture, geography, technology, and sheer chance all play roles that Marx tended to subordinate to economics. One of Marx's most interesting predictions is his theory of crises. The classicals, following Say's law, believed recessions were impossible or, at most, brief adjustments. Marx said they were wrong. That capitalism produces crises periodically and inevitably. His reasoning was as follows. Capitalists compete with each other and need to cut costs to survive. The primary way to cut costs is to replace workers with machines. But workers are also consumers. If you reduce wages and eliminate jobs, you reduce demand. And if demand falls, nobody buys what you produce. Marx called it the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. As more is invested in machines and less in labor, profits tend to decline. Capitalists compensate by exploiting workers more, by opening new markets, by speculating. But in the long run, contradictions accumulate and explode. Look at history and decide for yourself. 1873, 1929, 2008. The periodic crises of capitalism are a fact. Whether Marx's explanation is correct is another question. But the prediction, at least in its most general form, was accurate. Marx was a brilliant analyst. But his ideas have serious weaknesses that deserve equal rigor. First and most fundamental, the labor theory of value does not hold up. The value of a good does not depend solely on the labor needed to produce it. It depends on the utility consumers assign to it, on scarcity, on preferences. An hour of labor digging a useless hole does not create value. The marginalists, as we will see in the next episode, demolished this idea in the 1870s. Second, Marx predicted that capitalism would progressively impoverish workers until it provoked a revolution. That did not happen in the most industrialized countries. Real wages rose. Middle classes were created. Capitalism turned out to be more flexible and adaptable than Marx foresaw. Third, the revolutions that invoked his name occurred in agrarian countries, not industrial ones. Russia, China, Cuba. The exact opposite of what Marx predicted. And the resulting regimes produced forms of oppression that had nothing to do with worker liberation. Fourth, Marx systematically underestimated the capacity of democracies to reform capitalism from within. Unions, universal suffrage, the welfare state, labor regulation. Capitalism did not destroy itself. It reformed. But these criticisms do not nullify everything he said. His analysis of the concentration of capital, of recurring crises, of the system's tendency to generate inequality, of alienation at work, continues to resonate. Not because Marx was right about everything, but because he saw real problems that classical economics preferred not to look at. A distinction that is often ignored must be made. Marx, the analyst of capitalism, and the regimes that used his name are different things. Marx wrote very little about how a post-capitalist society should function. His most important works are analyses of capitalism, not blueprints for an alternative system. Capital is a meticulous dissection of how the capitalist economy works. It is not an instruction manual for building a socialist economy. What Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and others did with Marx's ideas is their responsibility, not Marx's. Just as what certain regimes did with Adam Smith's ideas is those regimes' responsibility, not Smith's. Judging a thinker by the worst acts committed in his name is a logical error. What we can do is evaluate his ideas for their analytical rigor, their predictive power, and the questions they opened. On those terms, Marx remains one of the most important thinkers in economic history, with all his hits and all his misses. In 2025, a logistics warehouse worker has his movements timed by an algorithm. He is paid by the hour. He has no permanent contract. His working conditions are decided by someone who has never set foot in the warehouse. Marx did not know Amazon or algorithms. But the question he asked remains valid: who benefits from whose labor? How much of the value a worker creates does the worker keep, and how much does the company keep? You do not have to be a Marxist to consider these questions legitimate. The debate about inequality, stagnant wages, precarious employment, and the concentration of wealth in the 21st century is, in large part, a continuation of the debate Marx opened in 1867. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, surplus value is Marx's central idea. Capitalism works because the worker produces more value than he receives. It is a powerful thesis, but it depends on the labor theory of value, which has serious weaknesses. Second, Marx predicted that capitalism generates periodic crises and a tendency toward concentration of capital. In this, history has largely proved him right. But he also predicted the growing impoverishment of workers and revolution in industrialized countries, and in this he was wrong. Third, the analyst of capitalism and the regimes that invoked his name must be separated. His questions about exploitation, alienation, and inequality remain relevant. His answers are debatable. And that is exactly what makes a thinker important. Marx challenged the classicals from the left, questioning the moral foundations of the system they described. But in the 1870s, a very different revolution was underway. 3 economists, working independently in 3 different countries, were about to rebuild economics from scratch. Not with politics. With mathematics. And they would solve a problem that neither Smith nor Marx could solve: why a diamond is worth more than a glass of water. That, next time.